Hello and welcome to today's edition of Extraordinary Outcomes. I'm Shubhanjan Sarkar, your host and founder of PitchLink, the buyer-seller engagement platform. Our guest today is Laura Cesari, founder of the research firm Supply Chain Insights. As an enterprise strategist, Laura focuses on the changing face of enterprise technologies. Her research is designed for the early adopter seeking first mover advantage. With more than 30 years of diverse supply chain experience, Laura spent 12 years as an industry analyst with Gartner Group, AMR Research, and Altimeter Group. Prior to becoming a supply chain analyst, she spent 15 years in building of supply chain software at Manugistics and Descartes Systems Group, and several years as a supply chain practitioner at Procter& Gamble, Kraft General Foods, Clorox, and Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream, now a division of Nestle. A prolific writer, Laura is the author of enterprise software blog Supply Chain Shaman with over 15,000 readers every week. She also writes a blog for Forbes and is a LinkedIn influencer. She co-authored two books, Bricks Matter and Supply Chain Matrix That Matter. Academically, Laura is a continual learner. She has an MBA from the Wharton School of Business and a BS in Chemical Engineering from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Laura is currently enrolled in a DBA program at Temple University in Research Methods. Meet Laura Cesari. Laura, welcome to the Buyer Side Chat. I'm delighted to have you here today and learn from your vast experience of dealing with the buyer side of the process. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And, my heart goes out to everyone in India and Asia struggling with these COVID times. Tough stuff. I think it's heartening that we may have global companies, but we need to act regionally. But my name is Laura Cesari, and I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights. And my road has been 20 years of manufacturing experience, buying materials, running factories, running distribution centers for companies like Procter & Gamble, General Foods, which got purchased by Philip Morris, which then spun off to Kraft. Clorox, makers of bleach and salad dressings, and Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream, which was purchased by Nestle. And then I went and built software for about 10 years with a company called Manugistics in the planning space. And then I decided I needed a mega perspective, so I went to Gartner Group and was an analyst at Gartner for a couple of years. And then I decided Gartner didn't care as much about supply chain as I did, so I went to a company called AMR Research and ran the research teams there. And most people don't remember AMR, but it was a very focused company on delivering research to the line of business user, whereas Gartner focuses more on the IT buyer. And thought I'd be there until I retired, but the founder wanted out and he sold the company to Gartner. And I'm like, I don't believe in the Gartner model. So Laura is not ready to retire, so she's got to find something to do. So I started Supply Chain Insights. And I write in front of the firewall. I write for Forbes. I write for LinkedIn. I write on a blog called the Supply Chain Shaman. It's hard for me to believe that the blog Supply Chain Shaman is now almost a decade old. It's got 500 posts, and I take the best read post and build an ebook each year, which is available on Amazon and Flipping Book, and I have a couple of hard copy books. But I try to help business leaders gain first mover advantage by understanding the shifts in technologies and processes to really drive a difference. And I think that most supply chains are stuck. We've got a backward slide over the last decade, and I just want to help people to move forward.
Wow, that's like, it's triggering so many thoughts in my mind already. But let me start with a basic question. The way a buyer's journey is looked at in a B2B buying selling scenario from the sales point of view is significantly different, to say the least, from what actually is going on in the buyer's side. Where is the major disconnect from your point of view?
Well, I think there are a couple of major disconnects. And I'm just so let's focus on buying materials for manufacturing and looking at consumer products or food and beverage or household durables. In the last decade, procurement has become more of an island within manufacturing, and we have automated procurement to make it more efficient, but in the process, we've made it less effective. So our planning processes in our manufacturing don't really go into material buying. They basically stop with manufacturing constraints down to finite scheduling. And we're very dependent on MRP, which MRP is in the operational executional horizon. And so a lot of the, basics around aggregate buying, supplier development have been lost over the last decade, sadly. And, when I work with companies and I ask them to draw the supply chains within their manufacturing organizations, most companies have a trend that they're starting to draw out procurement as kind of an island, right? That the only connection is MRP, and that the evolution of the CPO against the supply chain leader, we've become much more functional, and the focus on purchase price variance will throw the supply chain out of balance. So when a seller of goods interacts with a company, they'll have many people that they'll interact with. It'll be a person in new product launch or new product development who's trying to buy materials. There'll be a procurement buyer. There may be a buyer that's dealing with outsourced manufacturing. But the communication within that organization has become tougher, and the signals for procurement to be able to align the buy to the company's needs are more arduous and more difficult than they were a decade ago. And a lot of it has become a focus on indirect and a focus on strong functional silos, which makes procurement less effective and harder for someone to effectively build a relationship with.
So let me step back a bit and ask you this, that originally, if you see the role of the procurer, it was essentially to negotiate a better price, and they were not really experts in either material or business process or manufacturing process or any of that. Their role traditionally, when if you go back in time, was to negotiate, and from there, as you rightly pointed out, the role of the CPO emerged, which was sort of like what happened to the CIO during the Y2K, that the CIO moved to the CXO table, and the objective at that point was, when the CPO role emerged post the 2000 crash,
Right.
is that this role is going to also go to the CXO table, but something went wrong there, right? What is actually going on this side, so that the sellers can understand what should be the approach to actually manage this multi-member team, which is actually the de facto CPO today?
Well, I think that getting clear on the process, in that Kraft, is not like Procter and Gamble, not like Unilever. There's no one real model. And if I were selling to food and beverage CPG, I would identify my roles and my personas and my interaction, and who's managing outsourced manufacturing, where they are on supplier development capabilities. Do they have capabilities for aggregate buying capabilities? A decade ago, there was a lot of focus on strategic buying, aggregate buying, commodity plans. Today, there's less of that. So I would be looking at that, and I'd be looking at, the company's ability to do bidirectional orchestration, to look at alternate bills of material, alternate sourcing, and the risk management practices. And I would look by persona at that interaction, and I would not generalize. And I would try to open up the doors the best I could through working with new product launch, ingredients, services, helping any way I could, because that's how you're going to drive new business.
Sure. So how do you get your foot in the door? I mean, how do I, as a supplier or a vendor wanting to deal with a Unilever or a Procter and Gamble, or any large company, how do I know when do I start mapping the organization, for starters? How do I know who is actually working on supply development or whether they're doing it at all? If they're not, so where do you begin and when do you begin?
So I think that you begin with new product launch. There are lots of shows in the old days, pre-COVID, where you would have like ingredient fairs, or you would have plastic forums, whatever you're selling. I would start with trying to get my foot in the door for a new product launch. New product launch is responsible for cost savings. They're responsible for new product ingredients. And so I would try to open up the door there. And then I would, build the best relationships I can. And I would start to map the organizations by asking simple questions like, how do you manage buying? Do you do aggregate spend analysis? Are you doing MRP or DDMRP? Are you looking at supplier development? What's important in your buying processes? And then I would start mapping and moving through the organization to try to understand what drives value.
So tell me, Laura, how open are potential buyers or prospects to answer such questions? Will they actually share what is the decision making map inside the organization? I mean, do you actually get to find that out?
I've never been selling. I've bought, but I've never sold. I think, yeah, I think so. I think that most people want to help, and you've got to ask the questions in the right way, and you can't be aggressive. But I think most people want to help, and you can easily find out if they've got supplier development programs or what their corporate social responsibility programs are, and just from their website, their corporate ethics. But I find, yes, I think so. I don't find that to be a barrier.
How has the buyer actually changed in the last 2 decades? Because prior to internet, the buyer was dependent upon the salesperson for a lot of information. Your source of information, besides the trade shows that you just mentioned, was the salesperson. And obviously, post internet, that has completely changed. I mean, today you don't need to talk to any salesperson to get information, and data being sort of shared says that 60-70% of the buying journey is over even before a single vendor is spoken to. Where are you on this? How has the change happened, and what change are you seeing?
Well, I think that there's more catalog information, there's more ingredient information, definitely available, but I think you still need door openers. You still need the ability to forge relationships. While you've got a lot of content available, I think that there's no substitute for real relationships. So I think that the salesperson's become more of a relationship manager.
How has the buyer's process changed internally because of this disintermediation of information that has happened?
I think the buyer has become more of an order taker. And I find that there are more junior buyers. There's less focus on strategic relationship development. And so I think that's a problem.
Can you elaborate a bit on this? Let's sort of unpack this thought.
Yeah, I think that, there's been a focus on outsourced procurement. There's been a focus on RFPs, RFQs, mechanized procurement. There's been a focus on, how can I outsource payables? We've focused on mechanization, not necessarily value, and relationships. And I think that, the CPO has been very focused on cost, and I think we have more junior buyers.
So that cost factor of minimizing cost or maximizing value, whichever you look at it, still remains a key activity for the CPO?
I think it's a driving activity for the CPO. The CPO typically will report to the CFO, and it's, very much about cost, not necessarily about value. And most companies don't don't even know how to answer the question, how do you define value? It's actually a funny activity to ask companies, how do you define value? First you've got to be very comfortable with pregnant pauses, because you're going to get this look of, I wish you hadn't asked me that question. So, yeah, it's unfortunately become much more about cost and less about value, and companies struggle to define value. And both the IT organization and the chief procurement officer now have more of a reporting relationship to finance, and it's unfortunately much more about cost.
So this whole discourse that the CPO is moving into a more strategic role and they're becoming business process or manufacturing process experts, and thereby they're in a much better position to add value. You don't think that is happening, is it?
I do not think that's happening. No. I do a lot of speaking at the strategic procurement organizations in the United States. I do research on supplier development programs, corporate social responsibility programs, how people plan procurement, building of networks. And I think that we have focused on procurement efficiency at the cost of procurement effectiveness. And to me, an effective procurement organization is managing networks and looking at value. And an efficient organization is looking at, cost and reducing cycles. And so I think that the strategic CPO is hard to find.
Obviously, this is something very close to your heart, what I can sense. Dig in a little more in the sense, why do you think that is happening, while it's quite obvious that that path which was sort of developing of the CPO's role to be a strategic contributor and not only just a negotiator of price made a lot more sense. I mean, pretty much like, as I said, if I draw a very simple parallel with the CIO's role prior to Y2K. I mean, the CIO was just, again, someone who was procuring, who was, actually taking calls and saying, hey, my cartridge for my printer is over. Can you get your team to come and install it or whatever? My driver is not working. So that was really the role of the, there was no CIO. It was the head of IT or something like that. But that became a strategic role because technology was playing that role, and technology came center stage for any company, right? And procurement has a very similar kind of trajectory, yet you feel that it's not really going that direction, the strategic direction. Why do you think that is happening?
Well, I think in the last decade, we've had what I call the backward slide in companies and manufacturing organizations being able to deliver value. And the reason I say that is we're holding 20 days of more of inventory on average when we went into this COVID period, and we than we did in the Great Recession, and we are stuck at the intersection of growth and operating margin. And we've been very focused on cost, and you can squeeze pennies, but not necessarily drive value. And most companies are not clear on how do they define supply chain excellence? How do they define value as they look at source, make, and deliver together? And we're not good at designing organizations. So I have a chemical engineering background. I wouldn't have been able to get out of chemical engineering school if I couldn't design heat exchangers and distillation columns. But only 9% of companies actively design their supply chains, and 80% of resources are in the supply network. And so when you look at the design of the network, we should actively be designing not just where the sources are coming from, but the flows and, source, make, and deliver together. And we should be actively driving bidirectional orchestration. So let me tell you a story. I used to run an ice cream plant, and I managed the dairy boards in California. California has some pretty active dairy. And there were 22 different formulas for vanilla ice cream. And depending upon what was happening in the dairy markets and what was happening in my commercial markets, I would choose the formula that I was going to run based upon dairy fat and skim and the composition of milk, right? Milk powder, etc. And I basically did bidirectional orchestration to be able to deliver high quality ice cream and manage cost market to market. Today, people can't get out of their silos to even have a conversation about alternate bills of material or alternate sourcing, right? Because we're so stuck in transactional efficiency, wrote bill of materials, fixed suppliers, RFPs, et cetera, that we can't have cross-functional discussions to even, have that kind of discussion. And I think it's sad because there's so much value cross-functionally market to market if only we could, break the chains of the silos. And I think the evolution of the CIO and the CPO reporting to the chief financial officer and the heavy investment in ERP really are chains that bind us into, driving efficient, less effective processes.
This is really interesting because what you just described actually should have been made very, very easy using technology. The example that you used, a scenario like that should actually have been aided by technology. And this has not happened. Instead, technology decided to simplify things, saying, okay, we'll only do it this way. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Well, we invested in transactional systems on relational databases, which are very black and white. Mm-hmm. And the supply chain is really very gray and full of semantics. And particularly as we deal with procurement, where we're dealing with grades and alternate sourcing and alternate bill of material, that technology was never set up to deal in the shades of gray. Mm-hmm. And we basically invested in functional efficiency and inward-facing processes. And ironically, our operations became more global, more dependent on networks, but we do not have interoperability between the networks. So Ariba doesn't interoperate with Elimica, which doesn't interoperate with EDA Open. There's nothing that forces interoperability between procurement and transportation networks. And I actually lead a group called the Network of Networks. It's a volunteer group. Anybody can join it. And we study how networks are evolving in network technology. And there's no single sign-on. There's no single directory. We're not really holding people accountable for being good trading partners. And so the business models that evolved at the technology level really forced us into efficient procurement, very focused into the indirect model, where indirect procurement is much more black and white than direct procurement. And as a result, we've just put all our energy there, and a lot of the understanding of the direct world for semantic reasoning is lacking in the industry, and we're continuing to go into relational databases, hard-coded logic that doesn't really serve the supply chain very well.
Very interesting. So where do you think this is headed, Laura? According to you, if you look out 10 years from now, where do you see procurement and the procurement role being, and how do you think the vendor side can help make this transaction a guaranteed better outcome for both sides?
Well, I'm hoping that the pandemic is a crisis that we don't let go to waste. If you look at the pandemic, we have lots of stories of supplier failure. And whether it's the chip issues that we're dealing with now in automotive, or whether it's the plastics issues, we are not good at managing strategic relationships at a manufacturing level. And I would actually like to have all the people selling goods to reward manufacturers for good forecast, right? And it was interesting. I saw this practice when Jabil, I worked with Jabil, they would actually have a price structure. If a company gave them a good forecast, they got a good discount. If they had a horrible forecast, they were penalized. Well, we have nothing that puts teeth into, the forecast sharing or, the predictability of supply. We have nothing that, rewards people for being good trading partners for, ASNs or, electronic delivery. We've focused on big sticks like, payables versus, carrots. And I would like to see us focus more on carrots of, good behavior. And I'm hoping that some of the lessons out of the pandemic will be kind of illuminating that people can stop their wayward practices of, transactional efficiency that leads us down, paths that really aren't good for the organization.
Do you really believe that vendors can actually induce better behavior in terms of procurement, in terms of buying in the buyer's organization?
Depends upon how important that ingredient is. If it's a commodity, no. But if it's something that is, highly sought after and a specialized material, yeah. I think that, giving discounts for good forecast, I mean, your buyer may laugh at you, is something to consider, particularly for somebody in contract manufacturing services, where you're actually tying assets to future demand. And I also think that you can reward for being a good buyer, in terms of number of changes on purchase orders. The changes on purchase orders went through the roof in the pandemic, and purchase order synchronization was very problematic. So, purchase order cleanliness, matching. I'm a small vendor, and I probably deal with, I don't know, 120 outsourced services, and it's a nightmare. Invoices get lost. It's hard to find an invoice. They pay the wrong bank. It's just a nightmare. And so, I think, the easier a company is to do business with, we should reward them.
When we think of influencers in a buying decision,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, if you're buying something you've already bought, you have a system in place. But if you're trying to buy something new, it may be technology, it may be material, it may be machinery or whatever it is. I presume that you will take help of external experts as an organization to sort of focus on the right path or right flow. How important is peer groups in this decision making process? So if you are the head of procurement of a company, how likely are you to talk to a group of peers and say, hey, this is what we are planning to do? Do you guys have any suggestion?
Well, it depends upon the buying. So in my market, which is advice, I give advice on, the future of technology. It's very relational. And most of my business comes from helping people. So I have, 322,000 people on LinkedIn. I create goodwill by helping people find jobs, helping connect people. And that usually, will lead to business for me in terms of, what goes around comes around. But if I'm selling a commodity product like a plastic or a gum or a resin, that's not a relational sell. That's very much about new product launch. I get the product and then I start to land and expand, and I'm working the organization strategically. So it's very different depending upon what you're selling.
If I'm a, or rather, if you are the CPO and you are buying some new complex technology or product or new commodity for a new line of business, for example, uh, how likely are you to take into account your peer group who are not necessarily inside your company but outside your company, your peer group in the procurement community, and take their advice while you are looking at this new purchase challenge?
Again, I think it depends upon what it is. If it's equipment, you probably will. If it's
Okay.
services, you probably will. If it's an ingredient, you're going to be looking at performance and new product launch. So it really depends upon what you're buying.
Thank you very much, Laura. I really appreciate you taking the time right in the morning. I really appreciate that you did reach out and we could connect and we could do this today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks for helping people around the world. And please be safe in India. I'm praying for all my Indian friends.
Thank you. Next week, we bring you a bonus episode of our limited series, Fixing the 5% Conversion Problem in B2B Sales. You will meet Kevin Dixon, founder Boxstep, Abhijit Vijay Varghia, co-founder and CEO of Nectar.ai, and Jitendra Sindwani, president and head aviation business at IBS Software. As we come to a close of this series, the response has been overwhelming. Thank you. You can still share what you think about this elephant in the sales room. Please use the link below to record your views in video, and we will continue to showcase them in our upcoming episodes. Time to wrap up for today. Remember, you will soon have access to the complete interviews and transcripts. Keep an eye out for the link in the Extra newsletter. And thank you for watching. Until next time, stay well and craft extraordinary outcomes.